Greetings, pilots, and welcome to Fly's Flight Academy. My name is Kavakas, otherwise known as Flyteco on Sotor, and today we're going to be continuing our ship breakdowns, moving on swiftly to the Scouts. These are the glass cannons of the bunch. They are really fast, but also really flimsy, and overall are kind of really fun to play and have a bunch of nice little playstyles to them. We are going to be starting off with the Flash Fire. Not the Flash Fire. We're going to be starting out with the Novadive, and we're going to go down in descending order from Nova to Spear Point to Flash Fire. This first one is for the Novadive. It is commonly ran as your disturbance ship. However, it does have a few subtypes. Namely, there is a damage subtype, which is kind of weak on the Novadive, but still prevalent, as Scouts do have really high damage output just as base. Running a stock Novadive actually feels hilariously good, just because it kind of already built itself, but once you really refine the ship, it really shines. This means, or with this said, the ship does have really high speed, as with all the other Scouts. With higher speeds, it means you could play a lot more aggressively, however you do have to remain evasive, as you do have significantly lower health, and overall, it's pretty easy to kill a Scout if they don't play correctly. And by play correctly, I don't necessarily mean in the traditional sense. I kind of mean you have to be more creative with your flight patterns, in a sense. So you really have to, instead of straight lining people, you kind of have to weave in and out and kind of find more interesting paths to engage from. Typically, this means flanking, stuff like that. On the Novadive in particular, when we get into systems, I will give you a couple more tips for this, because its flight patterns do change based on its builds, but not dramatically to a point where you really have to commit to memory different forms of flight. Starting off with our primary weapons, we've got a decent stack here. You'll kind of notice with the Scouts, there's this particular cannon here, the laser cannons. I don't think I've quite ranted about these yet in this particular run through. Laser cannons are horrible. They have no real benefits, and their tier 4 traits are weak. Their tier 1 through 3 are similar in fashion to quad laser, in the fact that they just give you base stat increases, but their power cost is high at base. Its reduction brings it down to 15.8, but even that's just to bring it in line with light laser, and that's kind of bad. It has the stock. It's not great all over. It just really doesn't have anything going for it that the other two options otherwise give you, just kind of at base. So I'm not really going to be talking about laser cannons as an option. I personally believe that they have no place on this ship, and frankly, no place in GSF as a whole. I'm gonna just, right now in this particular video, I'm gonna say that I'm not going over laser cannons for the rest of the series. I'll acknowledge that they're bad every time I see them, but I'm not gonna go over them, because sincerely, they just don't do anything for you. And that's kind of my explanation for that. But to counteract that, you have two amazing options in light laser and rapid fire cannons. I'm going to go with them in descending order, mostly because light laser cannons, I believe that, at the very least, these are my personal favorite. I do believe that these are the strongest option for this ship. And for Scouts as a whole, minus the flash fire is kind of a weird one in the Scout sense, because it's more of a traditional ship than the rest. But we'll get into that when we get to the flash fire. Otherwise, for just general Scout play, light laser cannons is amazing. This is mostly due to the fact that even though they lack armor pen, they have extremely high damage. And I mean, it's on paper, it's only like 200 extra from rapid fire. That 200 extra hits really hard, especially when you put into consideration that with these ships, there is 0 shield penetration going on. There's like a little bit when it comes to your secondaries, but outside of that, 0. you're basically fighting someone from full shields to end of their health. So you really need high damage to just slowly tear through that. And what I think people tend to not quite realize with scouts, their place in GSF as a whole is never really to fight heavy targets. You're not really sending a scout in to fight a bomber because like 2 or 3 mines can just evaporate a scout. And the Novadive is the best at dealing with bombers, but in a meta where bombers are the number one thing, you're not going to see you're really not going to see Novadives. You're going to see more along the lines of your pikes and gunships mostly, because the counter to bombers is just not engaging them. In domination, that changes. Obviously, you need to push them off the point, but at that point, you send in an aggressive strike fighter, and that's tanky enough to survive long enough that you can push the bomber out of position for your gunships to hit. So what scouts do is they hunt gunships. Number one, if you want to fight a gunship, scouts are your best bet. Hands down, there's no better replacement. And when we get into secondaries, you'll see why. And number two, they're kind of skirmishy. The Novadive in particular, you're really kind of playing an in and out playstyle, and you're really playing into a lot of certain things where you're fighting squishy targets, and light lasers, surprise, surprise, they fill that void quite nicely. There's a slight learning curve, as with all things short range. You really just need to learn to aim in close quarters combat. It's not too difficult, honestly. With scouts in particular, their weapon options have extremely high firing arcs with really good accuracy, so you're kind of able to learn to track with scouts really well. And honestly, if you're learning to aim, I do highly recommend trying to play a scout. While the Starguard is the quintessential GSF ship, scouts kind of force you to aim because the Starguard has a way to strip shields and really effectively, and then after that you can clean them up as long as your aim is good enough. With scouts, your aim has to be pretty dang good to see success with them. They kind of share the same aim curve as gunships, in my opinion. It's slightly more forgiving because of the whole you can spray these weapons, but you can't really spray a railgun, so there's that. Outside of that, it's really just learning how to track people in short ranges. And the cool thing is with scouts in particular, people make the mistake of staying in your close quarters and staying well within your firing arc. So as long as you're keeping track of them in sort of the looping pattern that happens a lot in GSF, you'll actually be able to kill them before they can realistically do anything to you, and you're in an advantageous state in that close quarters because most ships don't really have a good way to deal with scouts in like the really, really short range, so it's kind of nice. For tier 4 and tier 5 of your light laser cannons, you're going to want to take the increased firing arc and tracking. You are going to notice that this is everywhere, and scouts in particular really love to have a good firing arc because they're in that close quarters, so this is pretty much a must. Crit is terrible everywhere except the flash fire, so when we get to the flash fire, you'll finally get your fix of a crit build if you really want to build one. But for now, never build it. Moving on to tier 5, you're actually going to take increased hull damage. I know I said you're going to have to break through shields, but honestly, with how much damage these do anyways, you're going to break through their shields really, really fast, no matter what. So just kind of build increased hull damage and give you that extra finishing power that you really need. Moving on to the armor penetration cousin of the light lasers, the rapid fire laser cannons. These are the same gun, but with less damage and armor penetration. And when I say the same gun, I quite literally mean they're practically the same weapon. They have very similar stats, very similar damage profiles. The things that change is like power draw and rate of fire. That's really it. And armor pen versus not armor pen. So, with that in mind, scouts have the luxury of having two really, really strong options for whatever meta is in the game. because for non-armor metas, you run light lasers. If you're in an armor meta, you run rapid fire, and you just get it at tier 3, which, by the way, is insane. Tier 3 is super achievable and really cheap to get to. So unlike heavy laser cannons and stuff like that, where you get it at like tier 4, and even on the concussions when you get it at tier 5, you're getting it really early on for very little cost. So if you are planning on running rapid fire instead of light laser, I extremely seriously advise you to just tier 3 it, and you can leave it until like really late in your build. In fact, you can leave it until the end of your build. Once you're finished upgrading all this stuff, you can upgrade rapid fire last as long as it's been sitting at tier 3. I really wouldn't recommend pushing it past tier 3 until you have the extra requisition for it, because it really just kind of gains minor buffs at that point. Its firing arc at base is 44 degrees. That is a very large portion of your screen, and this is just adding an extra 2 degrees to bring it up to a nice 46 to just add a little bit more on the edges and reduce the penalty, which honestly on scouts isn't horribly an issue. Their tracking accuracy is still super consistent. You'll find that on the very fringes of your screen, you'll experience a little bit of accuracy, a little bit of an accuracy decrease, but it's nothing that's going to like change your time to kill dramatically. It's honestly totally fine. You're running same tier 4 and tier 5, firing arc tracking and increased all damage, pretty much for the same reasons. These actually have relatively similar DPS in the sense that these have higher rate of fire but less damage, so they're kind of keeping up, but these have higher damage and lower rate of fire, so it's kind of, they sincerely do the same thing, so it's really up to personal preference whether or not you want the armor piercing. I don't know what it is. I personally think light laser cannons just really feel smoother. I don't know if it's like an animation thing, I don't know what it is, but light laser cannons really just feel superior. And I tend to see higher tier scout players actually run light laser. So to me, that kind of states that it has merit. And for that, I personally tried it and liked it. So there it is. Moving on to secondary weapons. And this is kind of a nice talking point here. All of these options are viable, but where they're viable is very different. I'm going to start with rocket pods, and then I'll go over the other two. I actually only talk about rocket pods in my notes. I am going to go over the other two briefly, as they aren't really in my notes. I'm just going to kind of say why they're there and why you might want to use them. But rocket pods, this is the #1 scout secondary, and this is because these are free firing. What that means is there is 0 lock-on, and they essentially fire with your reticle. Where these have a very high learning curve is their aim becomes a big problem. Their tracking accuracy is steep, so you really have to be accurate with them. They do have a nice high ammo pool, so that's super beneficial. It lets you kind of spam them. They have lower rate of fire, and that's where it balances out. If these had high rate of fire and you could just unleash these on people, that would be nuts. You frankly would kill people in seconds. But the main benefit of these being unguided is they deal with gunships incredibly, because you'll notice this a lot when you're running scouts, because you're going to be diving for those gunships. Gunships tend to rely heavily on their missile disengages to keep them alive. They pretty much always run distortion field on the ones that have it, and they pretty much always run barrel roll. But if you just straight up ignore having to lock onto them, they kind of have to make a choice, and you are just completely removing one of their modes of survivability from the equation. And these burst hard enough that I'd argue to say that you're really able to just you're really the #1 way to kill gunships. Anyone that has to lock on is immediately at a disadvantage when fighting gunships. So the Novadive in particular is the ship to kill gunships. The Flashfire fills the same role, but it's kind of different in the way that it does it. So again, when we get there, we'll talk about it. But that is the main thing of rocket pods. A secondary thing that you really have to worry about is actually ammo management. That 32 ammo is getting you far. It's doing wonders for you. There is an ammo option in here, and as much as I would like to recommend these, I can't. You really need that firing arc on the ship in particular, just since you're fighting a little differently. You're fighting very evasively and kind of moving a lot more. So you're kind of forcing yourself into not being able to straight line shoot someone. So you really need that extra bit of firing arc to just kind of push out how far you can shoot someone on a turn. At tier 5, or sorry, I didn't even go at tier 4 and tier 5. That was a learning curve thing. At tier 4, you are taking that increased firing arc. You do need to push it out a little bit. One thing of note for these rockets in particular, much like the rapid fires, these have an extremely strong tier 1 through 3. Tier 1 is just ignore armor. So if you're not going to get anything else, just put 1 tier in this and you're fine. Tier 2 is a rate of fire increase. I highly recommend you get this. It's not a huge increase, it's 8%, but that 8% does bring it up to almost 100, so it kind of matters. It's not like dramatic or anything, but it is nice and fairly important. At tier 3, you get shield piercing. It brings it up to 28%. While I do think that is useful, 20% is already a lot. So, and plus these don't have a really high damage base. So having extra shield piercing while helping you get more damage straight to their hull isn't really going to break the bank in terms of your time to kill. It'll shave off like maybe an extra quarter of a second or something minuscule. So if you want a tier 3, you can. Honestly, I still think you can get away with tier 1 and totally be fine until really, really late in the build, because these just do good damage at base. That's the one beautiful thing about rocket pods. They're already good, and everything in its tree just makes it better. So, talking about tier 4 and tier 5, tier 4, as I said, you're taking the increased firing arc. Tier 5, there are 2 options in here. One of them is increased range, and the reason you don't take increased range, and this is gonna sound weird, is rocket pods aren't good at range. They're very hard to actually lead once you get up to their max range of 6,000, and adding more range to that is surprisingly bad. It's giving you a false sense of extra security, which isn't there. You really, really, really want to be in that like 3,000 to 4,000 range with these. Heck, even 2,000 to 3,000. Like, you really, really want to be in there. So having extra range is a detriment. But the other option is plasma warheads, which on these in particular is really good, because these, while you're not getting an incredible amount of damage, what these are doing is it's giving you a little bit of more sustained damage to stop shield regeneration, or to stop full shield regeneration. There's obviously combat regeneration and yada yada yada. There's a bunch of crazy stuff, but you are preventing people from fully regenerating, and you're actually able to track people with these. And that's not to say you're not already going to have them targeted, but in the unlikely scenario where you are fighting a gunship and they get away from you, if you still have a warhead ticking, you have 6 seconds that you can still see where they went. And that basically means if you have to turn around and fight someone else while that gunship escapes, you can still see where the gunship went and then begin to chase after them after the fact. Because what you've done effectively in that scenario is you've already displaced them, meaning they've already had to move and kind of lose their advantageous positioning, and kind of, they obviously can move into another advantageous spot, but you're temporarily removing their ability to fight your teammates, and that in itself is good enough. And this little extra damage burn, it does, I don't think it stacks, but it does reapply with every rocket, so you're still getting about 1 tick per rocket just because of the RPM, just because of how the RPM is. So it's not terrible. Nothing to write home about, but like I said, these are already so good that just a little cherry on the top, honestly, at the end. You really don't need this. You honestly, you could stop at tier 4 with these, and I'd consider that done. But to master this ship, you need to get to tier 5, so you might as well get to tier 5 and have an extra little boost. Thermite and Sabotage. And the reason I didn't write these on my notes, and I didn't actually think about this, is because I actually have secondary builds in the build sheet for these, and that is because that they aren't really strong on scouts because of the way scouts want to fight. You really don't want to lock onto someone unless it's like cluster missiles, in which case, it's kind of why are you running cluster missiles instead of rocket pods? And that particular example only happens on the flash fire. So by running rocket pods, you are playing a scout. If you're running torpedoes and probes, you're kind of messing with your playstyle a little bit. Sabotage probe, I will note, is hilarious on the Novadive. It's a disabler, and if you want to run it, engine suppression and then I think power regen slow, that's your tier 4 and tier 5. It will be in my build guide. So there's that. Thermite is better on the spear point because it's a setup utility on scouts, not really a damage utility or a damage option. So that's neither here nor there. It's still a good option, but I still recommend, without a shadow of doubt, rocket pods is the best, which seems counterintuitive because in your systems, EMP field, you have an EMP baked into this ship. This is the core of this ship, and this is honestly what makes this ship good. Of note, I'm actually only going to talk about EMP because I've noticed that this video is already going on really long, and I kind of want to save time. The rest of my options all 4 of these, I'm pretty sure, do actually have builds, including Sensor Beacon, which is kind of funny. But I'm only going to talk about EMP because realistically, that is what makes this ship this ship. What EMP field does, it is a close range EMP burst centered around yourself within a 4,500 meter radius at base around you. It's an EMP for 10 seconds, which is kind of nice, but it has extra bonuses. So when someone gets hit by it, their accuracy is going to be reduced by 10%. Their sensors and comm ranges are going to be reduced by 5,000 meters, which is admittedly not super important, but still nice. And at base, it's going to disable their system ability, and it's going to increase your evasion by 10% for 4 seconds, which is okay. It kind of does the same thing as Distortion Field in a sense at tier 4. Not Distortion Field at tier 4, but EMP Field at tier 4 kind of does the same thing, and you really actually do use these in a survival way, and I'll get to that once we get to the tier 4. But essentially, what this is meant for, and this actually does go down from 45 to 30 seconds at tier 1, so I do highly recommend you get that tier 1 at the very least. Tier 2 and tier 3 are honestly really bad. That's kind of a shame, but it's okay. You really could tier 1 this in the earlier stages. Although, when it comes to building the Novadive, I do recommend you finish your EMP field first. So realistically speaking, you're going to kind of want to build this out. So if you get to tier 3 and can have tier 4, tier 4 is where this really becomes amazing, and tier 5 is like the golden reason you run EMP field. So at tier 4, you're going to pick Missile Lock Immunity. What this does is it makes you immune to missile locks, as the name entails, as well as 3 other allies around you in the range, which is kind of not important. Realistically speaking, you're using this greedily because of the way that the Novadive is. If you're using it for that missile lock invulnerability, chances are you're by yourself anyways, and you're running from enemies. So it's okay to use it in that way. Of note, I think this works the same way as an engine, rather than the same way of Distortion Field, because you can actually just snap off missiles, to my knowledge. Like, if a missile's already been fired at you, I'm pretty sure you could EMP field it off. Don't take my word for it. I still recommend preemptively breaking missile locks to try and give yourself as much time to run away as possible. But if it does work that way, you can use it that way. I still preemptive, be proactive instead of reactive. It's honestly a lot better. And at tier 5, oh, right, there's an increased range here. It's not important because you're already close range. At tier 5, you're going to pick engine suppression. The other option is shield suppression, which is a joke, so please don't take it. Engine suppression on this ship is hilariously not beneficial to you in a sense. It's not directly beneficial to your playstyle, but it is what it does do for you as the player is it will turn off their engines so they can't run away. But for your team, it lets your team have a good, I think it's 13 seconds, a good 13 seconds of free firing missiles on anyone that's been hit in your radius, which is insane. Of note, by the way, this does do damage. I believe it does like 100 hull damage or something small. So you can kill people with the EMP field. I've done it before. It feels great. Try it. It's hilarious. But overall, this is just really strong. And what I talked about earlier with the flight pattern for EMP, there's a weird learning curve with this where you have to kind of understand EMP's range because you're not really targeting a specific person unless you are directly chasing someone and intending to use EMP field. You have to really understand where you need to pop EMP. So, what I recommend early on when you're trying to learn how to use this is instead of trying to like finagle the ranges and get as many people as you can, just fly through where you plan to be and EMP at the middle point of your, like, directly on top of your enemies. At that point, you can't miss, and you're able to just turn back around and essentially go for a re-engage. So, it's good enough. However, as you learn to use it, as you learn the range, you'll be able to use it in chases more consistently. That's where I do believe the skill comes into play. Once you get that 4,500-ish meter range down, it's kind of less than 4,500. I actually recommend using it in 4,000 meters, so try and learn, again, that CQC style. But once you learn that, you'll be able to chase people a lot more effectively because they can't get away with you if they can't use your engines. Moving swiftly on, as I said, I'll have the rest of these in a build guide. I am actually building a website for all of this. By the time these videos are out, it'll be up. And descriptions for these will all be actually fully written. That's going to be like a hard document for this, so everything I'm describing in all of these videos is going to be there. And these three will also be there, and the reasonings and all that stuff. Yada, yada, yada. You get the point. Moving swiftly on to shields, you have a single option, and that is Distortion Field. Quick Charge Shield is okay, but not great, because you really don't have high enough shields to make it matter, and power converters suck. So you're realistically stuck with Distortion Field. There is kind of a problem with this. It is the best thing for survival at tier 3. You have to tier 3 this straight from the gate. So when you're building this ship out originally, you really kind of have to commit. And what's good is there's a sensors option here, so you can kind of not spend it there and spend it up here instead. But you really need to be on tier 3. Otherwise, this is nothing for you aside an evasion increase, which is good, but the way evasion works is fairly strange in GSF, and honestly, sometimes it feels like it doesn't change anything because people's aim can just ignore evasion, so it's kind of hit or miss whether it's actually doing anything good for you. So you really need to get to tier 3, where you're picking up Disable Enemy Missile Lock. Now, this isn't the same as an engine break. If a missile's fired at you, you cannot distortion field out of it, but if a missile's being locked onto you, you can break that lock. So, again, proactive versus reactive. You really need to be using distortion field if you're trying to escape early. Even if you're not trying to escape, if you're trying to engage someone and they're locking onto you, distortion field just before you think they're going to fire. That way, they don't have an opportunity to relock you. All that to be said, it's fairly short cooldown. It's 20 seconds, about the same as quick charge, honestly. And it's pretty good. It's honestly stable to scouts. The only one that doesn't really run it is Spear Point, but even then, the Spear Point has builds where it's there. There's only one build on the Spear Point, in fact, that doesn't run Distortion. So it really is just a staple of scouts as a whole. It's just really good. It's just another way to deal with missiles. Moving on to engines. Personally, I think that there are two options worth mentioning here, and these being Snap Turn and Power Dive. Barrel Roll is here. However, Barrel Roll is a super defensive option. Koyogrin is also here, but Koyogrin is a worse snap turn, and I'll get into that in a sec. Essentially, the way you want to fly scouts, Koyogrin doesn't really help, and Barrel Roll is honestly getting you away from enemies, which you don't want. You really want to be in the mix. So yeah, we'll start with Snap Turn, mostly because this is my personal favorite choice, and seemingly the personal favorite of a lot of higher end scout players. It is actually a really smooth movement, and I personally, when I first was learning it, I hated it because it felt really kind of jerky in the way you had to use it. But once you kind of understand how it's meant to be used, it's really good. What it does is it is a flat 180-degree turn, and what I mean flat, that means you are staying essentially vertical to the way you were going and just turning around. It's a really sharp turn too. It's like quick. So what you can do with this is actually the important reason why I think Snap Turn is incredibly important. Much like Retro Thruster, this can be used offensively. The difference being is you fly through someone and then Snap Turn behind them, and you'll immediately be facing them and be in a position to actually just chase them, because they have to commit something to turn around and face you again, because they were already trying to get past you to re-engage, but you were able to get around faster to re-engage on them before they could even account for it. So using this aggressively is actually really recommended. I cannot state how well this feels to just fly straight through someone, snap turn, and then just they're completely caught with their pants down. You now get to turn around, get a full volley of rocket pods off, and potentially just straight up kill them in that second pass. So I can't speak any higher of this option. It really just is a solid scout choice. It really fits the playstyle well. At tier 3, you're going to pick increased turn radius. This kind of goes without saying for most scouts, or for most ships actually. I'm pretty sure there's like 2 ships that don't run increased turn radius, and that's because they just don't have an option for it. So increased turn radius, it's really good. The second choice is Power Dive. I personally hate Power Dive. That's because it's just such a really weird turning pattern. What it does is, if you can look at the diagram here, it's not a flat 90-degree turn, because that's not how ships work. It is an arc, but it is not an arc that you don't follow on top of the arc. And what I mean is, if you look at the picture here, you don't go over it like this. You don't start in this position and end that same way, but just vertically down. What happens is you turn to face the inside of the turn, and it kind of disorients a little more than I would like. And it's not disorienting your enemy, that's for sure. It's disorienting you. All that said, and I've never used Power Dive except on like the Sledgehammer, and that's because it's the only option for it. But Power Dive is just so hard to get used to. But there's always a but when it comes to these long rants. It is one of, if not the strongest movement option in the game. And I don't mean that in the sense like the same way like retro thrusters is good for movement or snap turn. No, this is like really good disengage and aggressive movement. Aggressive less in the sense that you're using it like power dive or not power dive, snap turn or retro thruster or Koyagrin for that matter. You're not like re-engaging on someone, but what you're doing is you are power diving to completely disengage and give yourself a chance to kind of regen up and re-engage extremely quickly. Scouts have such incredible speed that if you disengage from someone, you still have a really good window to just turn around and re-engage. Even if you power dive past them, you're totally fine. As of note as well, there's another trick for power dive where at like the start of a domination match, you essentially completely flip upside down, kind of aim yourself downwards, and then power dive, and that'll flip you forward and move you fast. If you can do that in a seamless motion, it's okay to give you extra vertical movement. I honestly don't recommend doing it. And again, you're going to pick increased turn radius. This is a really low cooldown, so it's nice, but so is snap turn to a sense. I think it's like 15 versus 12 seconds, so it's not much of a difference there. At this point, it's personal preference. I do believe snap turn is stronger, just from a statistical point of view. So yeah, try both, see what you like. I personally do believe snap turn is a good choice, and this is kind of the loadout. And that was the Novadive. As I said, there is a lot of stuff I didn't talk about in this episode. That is all going to be covered in written form, in a build sheet, and a website, because frankly, they're not the main focus of this ship. And while they do have playstyles, literally, I don't think I've ever seen a single person swap off of EMP on a Novadive. There's no reason to, realistically speaking. If you want an aggressive scout, you pick the Flashfire. These are all fun options. The Sensor Beacon is hilarious, and in a different meta would actually be good. And this meta, EMP is just straight up better. So yeah, all that will be listed out though, because I do have builds for them, and it's actually pretty fun. So all that said, we'll be moving on to the Spear Point next, and continuing on from there. So in the meantime, hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I'll see you out in the skies. Bye-bye.